Right. Thank you very much for coming along, guys. And this is In Conservation With. I'm David Lindo. And today I'd like to talk to you about a very interesting place that I have kind of discovered over the last 10 years or so. It's Extremadura in Spain. And I'm sure quite a few of you are familiar with this region in Spain. I personally hadn't been there until 11 years ago when I turned up one March day. I was invited, I didn't just show up. And I just discovered this whole world, which was really interesting. And what I've done today is put together a talk at the behest of the tourism board, who are looking after, who actually promote the northern province of Extremadura, and that's who they are, the Diputación de Cáceres. Let me explain exactly what we're talking about in terms of Extremadura, because often people ask me, where is it? Well, this is a map of Spain, and if you can see Badajoz, which is right there in the southwest bordering Portugal, and it's actually right on the edge there, right down the bottom. It looks like Badajoz, but it's actually Badajoz, as they pronounce it here. And the Catharus province, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the Catharus province is the one in red. Basically, Extremadura is not only the northern part, which is Catharus, but also the southern part, which is Badajoz, which is the large lump of land directly underneath the red blob, right next to Portugal. And both of those areas combined are Extremadura. So Extremadura, I think it's the only region in Spain where there's only two provinces. If you look below, with Andalusia, there's, I think, maybe 7 or 8 different provinces. So it shows the difference. But anyway, it's the 5th largest region in Spain. And I've often said this, but I'll say it again, it's twice the size of Wales. It's also about the size of Switzerland. And if you're American, it's just under the size of Kentucky, the state. So it's a very big place. And to drive from one bit, from the north right down to the south, you're looking at least 3 hours drive. I mean, it's a huge place. I mean, I was flabbergasted when I first showed up as to how big this region is. So just to explain a bit more, this is how it's split basically. I'm talking to you from Mérida in the Badajoz province, which I think is slightly larger than the Catharus province. And obviously the Catharus province is the northern part, and its regional capital is Catharus itself, which we'll talk about very quickly and very shortly. Mérida is in fact the capital, the provincial capital of the whole region, much to the annoyance of many people in Catharus, and maybe even Badajoz, but certainly Catharus, because Catharus, Badajoz, and even Plasencia in the north are all far bigger than Mérida. Mérida has maybe 60,000 residents compared to Catharus's, I think, about 120,000. So it's double the size of Mérida, and I think Badajoz is bigger yet. So that's how it is. So there's a bit of rivalry. I mean, Mérida wasn't the capital until I think the mid-80s, when they decided to make it the capital because of the fact that there's so many Roman ruins within the city. It's a city with the most amount of Roman ruins in the whole of Spain. So it kind of made a good sort of choice to be, made the capital. Catharus is a very fascinating part of Spain, and a very fascinating part of Extremadura. Most people that actually go to Extremadura tend to have an itinerary which is mostly in that province, with maybe a visit to Mérida to stand on a bridge to look at the birds that are along the edge of the river Guadiana, which is the main river that runs through Mérida into Portugal. So yes, we're talking about the northern province today. And just to show you a bit more on the map, I couldn't actually find a map of the places that I want to talk to you about today. But if you can see where Catharus is, we're going to start a kind of a rough journey from Catharus and head north. And we're going to go between Catharus and Trujillo, which is right opposite to the right. Trujillo, some of you may know, is a very famous town, beautiful town square in the middle of the town itself, a very lovely old town centre as well, very medieval, and it's hailed as the headquarters, the main port from where all the conquistadores left on their visits, their murderous visits in many cases, to South America. And we're going to kind of go north as well as west. So Guadalupe, which is to the right. There's a few areas around there I want to talk to you about, and further north towards Navarro, that is the green area. There is where Monfragüe is, which is a very, very famous spot, which I will talk to you about briefly as well. So try and keep that map in your mind. But please, if you have any questions, ask me, and you can always also Google the particular sites to talk about. But it's going to be a general chat about some of the amazing landscapes and birds that you can find in this part of Extremadura. So we're going to start with the capital itself, Cáceres, and hopefully this will play. During the summer, in the old city, which is very medieval, you're going to be finding lots of swifts. They nest in the old buildings. As you can see, they've got tons of holes there in the buildings for swifts, as well as lesser kestrels. I don't know if you noticed a lesser kestrel land on one of the buildings there. But the predominant species is pallid swift, and also you have common swift there as well. It's a great place not only for for the cultural side, but it's also great for urban birding. And I love going there as part of tours, or even just going there just to go birding myself. Pallid swifts are all over the place. Quite a common species in Extremadura, often problematic, especially when they're seen outside of the range in terms of identifying them. They tend to be more blunter winged than the common swift, and they have a slight, again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but they've got a slight bulge here in their secondaries, which sometimes is quite prominent. But it's the coloration, especially seen in good light. They've got a much whiter throat usually, and they are more kind of chocolate brown compared to the jet black almost of common swift. And also their flight is far less frenetic. We all know about the swifts flying over Britain, in our cities and towns, very fast, flapping wings, really quickly, breakneck speed. I mean, these guys do the same as well, but they tend to glide more and less frenetic. But the key thing is the call. You are familiar, hopefully, with the scream of the common swift. The pallid swift has a more clipped scream. It's a shorter scream. And actually, it took me several years to work that out. Several years of being with them the whole time. I remember standing in someone's living room, and opposite, in the street opposite, there was the house opposite was a colony of pallid swifts. And I heard the call, and I thought, that's so distinctive. And it's one of those things that after a while, you do actually get to understand and hear clearly compared to common swift. Also within the city are colonies of lesser kestrel, beautiful migrant, unfortunately decreasing in number. The population in Extremadura has fallen a little, but interestingly, some of the key places where they are found and encouraged to breed are in fact in urban areas. 19 urban areas within Extremadura have been earmarked and protected for these birds, and sometimes I put up special tiles for the birds to nest within, because I love nesting on the old tiled roofs. So you can find them in the heart of Cáceres, but also if you remember from the map, if you go slightly west, and when I say slightly west, we're talking about 50 kilometers east, in Trujillo, you will find them nesting there as well. But also in the bull ring, there's a famous bull ring in the town, and there was once quite a large colony there. I mean, it's kind of shrunk a lot recently, but there was a large colony. They're a very beautiful bird. They tend to sort of disappear around about now. In fact, maybe in August, late August, they're mostly gone. Although there's some that winter. and they are very similar to kestrel, common kestrel, as you can see. But this is a male, and if you look under the wings, it's less barred than a common kestrel, if you can imagine. And plus, the colours are cleaner, less streaky than a common kestrel. The female also has less barring on the underwing, but can be a bit more tricky to tell apart. But yeah, and also they hang out in groups. They hang out as in colonies, and they hunt together. And often, when you see a kestrel flying like a, hovering, flying around and hovering, but then eating insects like a hobby, i.e., bringing its feet up to its mouth, you know that's a lesser kestrel, because common kestrels, I've never seen one do that. I don't know if you have, but I've never seen a common kestrel feed like that on large insects. Of course, you cannot think about Spain, anywhere in Spain almost, without the white stork in your mind. Actually, the white stork is most prevalent in the southwest of Spain, and in particular Extremadura. They love nesting on the old buildings. They raise their young earlier in the year, so all of them are now kind of finished nesting, or quite a while ago now, and they're out. Well, some of them have migrated. There's others that are still hanging around. There's a dump, for example, near me in the Badajoz province, where there's tons of them hanging out, feeding on rubbish, which has been an increasing sort of habit for this species, because in the past they used to clear off completely, but now the birds that turn up, especially in Catharus province as well as the southern province of Badajoz, tend to come from Western Europe, Germany and other places, and they come to winter there instead of flying on and into Africa. But research has shown that some of these birds actually sometimes migrate. The next year they decide not to migrate. They just do on a whim almost, which is quite interesting. Again, migration is such a fascinating subject. I'd love to talk more about that. But yeah, I just love looking up and seeing a white stork looking down on me as I marvel at its beauty. But when you see them, warts and all, they're not so beautiful. When you see them on a dump, for example, that white plumage is quickly soiled. And when you see them eating practically anything, your romantic view of them bringing babies starts to fade away. Around Cáceres, the city, is a lot of this kind of habitat, which is termed as Sierra, grassland. It's actually man-made. In fact, most of the habitat in Extremadura is man-made. I mean, I'm talking thousands of years ago, because this whole area used to be forested. The whole of this part of Spain was forested, but it was cleared, by ancient man for farming, etc., etc. This is what it looks like in the height of the summer, and this is what most people, especially people who, even in Spain, who think about Extremadura and who haven't actually been there yet, maybe, or know much about it, they imagine it to be a very parched area, and they think of the name Extremadura, thinking, oh, it's going to be really kind of extreme and whatever. But in fact, the name Extremadura comes from a word, I can't remember what language it's from, maybe it is even Spanish, but basically the land near the Jura, in the extremity of the Jura. The Jura is a river which is actually way north of Extremadura. So it's something that it's a bit of a misnomer in terms of people thinking it's about the weather. But actually, during the summer, it can be mightily hot. I'm talking about up to 44 degrees. And this summer has been no exception in terms of the temperatures. And even the locals, I mean, I know people who live in Cáceres and obviously in Badajoz and other places in Extremadura who have complained, that the temperatures have been rising over the years. It's never been this hot. And even now I'm sitting here and it does feel autumnal, especially in the mornings. But, we've been enjoying temperatures of up to 27 degrees recently. So it's still fairly warm and quite sunny. I mean, it doesn't rain that much, mostly during November through to sort of early May is the sort of rainy season, as it were. But even then, it's not incredible amounts of rain, and there is sometimes problems in terms of droughts. But in this particular habitat, you get all sorts of sort of Sierra type loving birds. I mean, sandgrouse is one particular family that exists in these areas. These are black-bellied sandgrouse. And I must say that I've tried to include photographs of the birds as you would probably see them, because that's how I see them half the time. I never or very rarely get very close to sandgrouse unless you're in a hide or something. So these are kind of more natural views of what you'll see. So you've got black-bellied sandgrouse, which likes areas with longer grass slightly, whereas the pin-tailed sandgrouse actually is more of an arid specialist. So they're much more to be found in this kind of habitat, funny enough. And on top of that, you've got the classic bustards. Great bustard is one of the target birds for people coming to the region, and the Catharus province is a great area, particularly around the plains of Trujillo and the plains of Catharus is a great place to try and find them. They're not always easy to find. I mean, sometimes you bump into them by accident, or you see them flying past like gigantic ducks flying past. But other times, I mean, I've been on tours and I've had to really work hard to find great bustards. They are very far away usually, sometimes hanging out with sheep, and they look as big as sheep, so sometimes you miss them because you think they're sheep, and they're very shy. Interestingly, the population, the official population, is seen to be or deemed as being around about 3,000 birds in the region, which is a lot. But the reality is there's probably half that number, and maybe, in fact, not even maybe, they have declined over the decades, mostly down to land use changes and maybe possibly climate change. You never know. The other bustard, the little bustard, has become increasingly difficult to see. I've gone whole years without seeing little bustard. Little bustard tend to hang out in areas with longer grass, so sometimes you don't see them at all unless they fly or there's a break in the vegetation and you see a head bobbing. And I've very rarely seen the classic displays of what they do that you often see in magazines and on Facebook. It's one of those things you need to be sitting in the hide overnight and being there the whole day for them to come closer to you in order to take those images. Amongst the Sierra grassland loving species are the larks. The calandra lark is a classic example, quite common in that kind of habitat as well as in farmland areas. Quite distinctive as well. They're larger than skylarks. They've got that black band across their chest or lower neck. And when they fly, they remind me sometimes of green sandpipers in that when they fly, they have this really dark underwing, which green sandpipers have. And they also fly sometimes, to me, wader-like, look like waders, but they sound a little like skylarks. The song sounds a little bit like a skylark, and the contact call sounds like the chirping of a skylark, which can be confusing during the winter when skylarks come as winter visitors to the region, because you have to listen carefully. Is that a skylark or is that a calandra lark? But when you see them together, the size difference is quite phenomenal. I mean, this bird is a big bird, makes the skylark looks quite small. And the other larks to be found, of course, are the crested lark and the Thecla's lark, which we'll talk about shortly, as well as during the summer, the greater short-toed lark is a summer visitor to these kind of areas as well. So we talked a little bit about the grassland areas. I mean, I could talk all week about the habitats and the spaces and places that you can visit. And also, even though I may mention particular birds seemingly associated with particular habitats, some of them can be found anywhere. Crested larks, for example, can be found in habitats like this, all the way into the middle of the city, walking around the streets. They are quite cosmopolitan, whereas the Thecla's lark tend to be more in areas like this and more rocky areas. But we'll talk about those shortly. But this is the Embalse de Guadiloba. Embalse is another word for reservoir, of which there are many in this region. Quite surprisingly, actually, I was very surprised at the number of reservoirs. And it's quite interesting because a lot of them are ginormous. I mean, this one is pretty big. I mean, to walk around it, you have to give yourself maybe 4 hours. It's massive. And this is one of the smaller ones. But it's like Scotland in a way. You go to lochs in Scotland and there's absolutely nothing on them. And then you go to another loch or another pond and there's loads of stuff. And that's how it seems to appear in Extremadura. I mean, some of those reservoirs possibly are, not haven't got many fish, even though there's people fishing there, I've noticed. Whereas others, which we'll talk about shortly, are much better for finding ducks and stuff. On this particular reservoir, which is, to say, very close to the outskirts of Catharus, it boasts good numbers of wintering gulls. There's two species that you would predominantly find in Extremadura and in the Catharus province, and they are the black-headed gull and the lesser black-backed gull, with smaller numbers of yellow-legged gull, particularly in the northern parts of Catharus, and occasionally during the winter there's one or two, well actually there's been quite a few last year, but a few Mediterranean gulls and one or two common gulls, and maybe one or two little gulls reported every now and again. So this is a good spot for looking for gulls. In terms of water birds, general water birds, this particular spot I've not seen that much really. Mallard, gadwall seem to head the list with cormorants, but then I've only been coming to this particular place recently, and as with many areas within Extremadura, the birding history, the records, is quite young. I mean, records, when you look at it, maybe the last 20 or 30 years, with a much sort of more prevalent presence of records in the last 15, 20 years. So it's a young place when it comes to recording birds. But this site is a fantastic place during the night, during the summer, to find redneck nightjar. They have a very different song to the European nightjar, which most of us may be familiar with. The European nightjar, of course, makes this churring song, whereas this animal goes so it's a very different call, different song. It's a slightly bigger bird as well, and if you travel around slowly along the tracks, not only here but in other spots all around the province during the summer, and especially when it's a calm evening and it's been a hot day, and sometimes they come on the roads, you can travel in your car very slowly and come across them on the road, and you can even you can drive right up to them and they won't move. This particular bird I was probably about 5 or 6 feet away from, and I was on my belly taking shots. I got out of the car. They are kind of blinded by the lights of the car. So what I try and do is, go past them and hopefully they'll fly, because I'm worried that the drivers around here or around this region tend to drive fairly quickly and they might just, run it over without thinking. And in fact, there are unfortunately 1 or 2 corpses found on the roads of this particular species. They're summer visiting and they actually are still around even now. And sometimes, they're still reported into late October. So there's still a possibility of catching up with the redneck nightjar. Flying around the whole of the region practically, particularly around the motorways, but also near reservoirs and grassland areas, is the black kite. The black kite is a summer visiting raptor, very numerous, though some years they seem less numerous than others, but they are forever seen along motorways, feeding on roadkill. So they are very, very prominent, and they suddenly disappear in mid-August, heading south to Africa. 1 or 2 may be found during the winter, but mostly all of them are gone. And it's quite interesting because in August, should I say, they're gone by mid-August, and then there's like a month's gap, and then you start seeing red kites infiltrating. But red kites are nowhere as common as the black kite. And what I found really interesting was the fact that the red kite in Extremadura is quite a rare breeder. there's not more than maybe 150 pairs, I believe. Most of the birds that we see during the winter actually come from the northern parts of Europe, like Scandinavia, Germany, and those places. So that's a black kite. Also to be found in that kind of habitat and actually by that particular reservoir, but again, anywhere else that has similar habitat, of which there are many, many, many places in Extremadura. I mean, any corner you turn, there's a possibility of finding birds. I mean, it's, people come to this region, and in fact, I believe, this is why I believe actually, people who are birding tend to go to places where they think that that's the best place to see this, or this is the place where everyone else goes. And of course, that kind of does happen. But if you just turn a corner, you'll be finding your own birds, and half the time they're the same birds as the birds that you thought would be found only in one particular place. And this is one such bird, the great spotted cuckoo. When I first turned up in Extremadura, I thought they were just found in certain places, certain pockets. But then I realized that actually, if you sort of hang out in the right places, you'll see them. And I found this bird during the early parts of the summer feeding on a massive cricket near the Guadialoba. And it was quite surprising because I then found, several of them, they actually lay their eggs in the nests of magpies. So magpies aren't particularly fond of them. And often when you see a lot of magpies scolding something, it could possibly be one of these birds. But I saw a great spotted cuckoo even in the center of Merida. So they do get about. But they're one of those birds that suddenly just disappear again. They come really early in February. You hear them squawking away, and then maybe by June, July, you don't see them, and that's quite interesting thing anyway. On top of all of those birds, of course, are the larks, the crested larks, which are probably one of the most abundant birds in Extremadura. I mean, if you come to Extremadura and you haven't seen a crested lark, then as I do in Serbia, I'd say to you, I'd eat my binoculars, because there's no way you will miss a crested lark. But they are very similar to Thecla's lark, and I'll show you a Thecla's lark in a second. The crested lark has this really long, scraggly crest, and it's got a beak which is slightly decurved, and they are slightly bigger than the Thecla's lark, and they have a different song, which, to my ear, I still haven't really sussed it. The Thecla's lark is more musical, and their call also is less musical than the Thecla's lark. It's taken me 7 years to feel confident in identifying a Thecla's from a crested. I mean, sometimes fleeting views, you don't know which you've seen, but now I feel much more confident. So this is definitely a crested lark, whereas this is a Thecla's lark. It may look quite similar, but its bill is straighter, it's less decurved, in fact hardly decurved at all, and the crest, believe it or not, is actually a bit shorter and less scraggly. But the thing for me is the fact that it's got this slight kind of eye ring. Sometimes its eye, to me, looks like it's mounted like a chameleon, mounted on a mound of skin or whatever, and that makes me think straight away, oh, that's a Thecla's lark. Also, they're smaller, they are shorter tailed. They sometimes come across like woodlarks when you see them, very short tailed. And I think when you see enough of them, you start beginning to realize, that's a Thecla's, that's a crested, most of the time. And by the way, the Thecla's lark is named after a German ornithologist who discovered the species, and it's named actually after his daughter, who had a heart condition and died, and he called, he nominated the bird, named it after her. This is back in the 18th, 19th century, or whatever, back in the days of collectors. The Thecla's lark is also found in Northern Africa, and that's where your problems really start, because they look very similar to the crested larks, and I give up in Northern Africa. But in Spain, you've got more of a chance of telling who's who. Of course, the hoopoe is everywhere, even in the winter. Fantastic bird, and it's one of those birds, particularly in Britain, that we just revere. We just love the idea of seeing the hoopoe. And I remember as a kid thinking about hoopoes, on Vicar's lawns, because I used to read books that says, that said, you find them on vicars' lawns. And I always thought that was a kind of habitat, but obviously not. And they are found not only in the grassland areas, but also in the cities and towns, in the parks as well. And as I say, they're also found in the winter. As much as it looks beautiful, their nesting habits aren't so lovely. They are hole nesters, so they're in holes and in trees and other, mostly trees. And apparently the smell that emanates from those holes is akin to rotting meat. So as much as they look pretty, their home life isn't as wonderful. Well, certainly not to us anyway. Overhead will be various raptors, including booted eagle, which is a fairly common bird, particularly during the summer. I mean, in a few of them winter, but I think most of them actually move out during the winter. Black vulture is another that you'll be seeing flying overhead. I'll talk about black vulture in more detail in a minute, but basically it is Europe's largest raptor. These birds are ginormous. I mean, seen at a distance in the field, it looks like a sheep. In fact, is that a sheep? Oh, it's a black vulture. I mean, they are massive. Griffin vultures are also to be seen, very common. I've seen today, for example, flying over my house, so they're all over the place, which leads, it's a nice segue actually to the main sort of capital for all of these birds in most people's minds, and that is Monfragüe, and in particular this rock, Peña Falcón, which is absolutely one of the target areas that people come to when visiting Extremadura. You can't come to this region without visiting Monfragüe. Now, Monfragüe is in the northern part of the Catharus province, not quite at the border, but it's fairly close. And it's one of those areas of mountain ranges, and most of the area actually is inaccessible. So most of the vultures in the region nest in this area, and the total population of Griffin vultures, I believe, is just under 4,000 now, and the population of black vultures in the region is in excess of 900, which is incredible because the black vulture, which is also known as the monk vulture or the cinereous vulture, has a discontinuous range from Iberia, including Portugal, all the way through to Mongolia, but the population in Extremadura is the largest in the world, so you cannot fail to see them. Here's a griffin vulture on Peña Falcón, and they nest on the actual rock sides. Black vultures are more likely to be nesting in trees. The griffin vulture, as I say, is a very fairly common bird now in this particular region, and I understand that there's more vultures in Extremadura than the whole of India, which is a very, very sad state of affairs because, as you know, in India there's been problems with diclofenac, the drug given to cattle, which then the vultures feed on when the cattle die, and it renders them unable to breed. And they don't breed every year, they breed every few years, and the population just slides immediately. But they're fantastic birds, and if you go to Monfragüe, just spend at least half a day there, because that Falcon Rock can attract in excess. I mean, some days you can see at least 15 different species of raptor. It's incredible, including birds like the Spanish imperial eagle, which is a gorgeous, stunning rarity in the past. I think now there's about 500 pairs in the whole of Spain, but it is endemic to the Iberian Peninsula. Quite similar sometimes. I mean, this is quite distinctive looking at it here, but they're quite similar at the distance to the golden eagle. And the difference is, my good friend Martin Kelsey told me, was that when you see an eagle at a distance, and if it starts rocking its body as it flies, then that's a golden eagle, whereas Spanish imperial eagle tend to be a bit more ponderous in their flight. Stunning bird. It's slightly smaller than the golden eagle. Also in that particular area, but also all over in the mountainous or rocky areas in Extremadura, you will find blue rock thrushes. They are fairly common, gorgeous little birds, just a little bit bigger than the starling. The males are very, very blue. I think it's probably either a young male or female, but they're very, very gorgeous to look at. The habitat around Monfragüe and of course elsewhere in the mountainous region is very much like this sort of Mediterranean forest, which includes cork, oak, and other species of tree in the rocky kind of background as well. This area, Turgeon, is maybe 20 or 30 kilometers away from the Monfragüe Peña rock, but there's lots of habitat like this in that area and in other areas as well. And the classic birds to be seen in those kind of habitats include the short-toed tree creeper, which is very similar to the common tree creeper, but luckily the common tree creeper doesn't occur in Spain, or certainly not in Extremadura. So any tree creeper you see is likely to be a short-toed tree creeper. So again, they're quite obvious once you get your ear in. They've got quite a loud call. And then another classic bird of that habitat, which is also, I suppose, called the dehesa, which is basically cork oak woodlands, man-made, which has been for generations, and they are there basically so that the Iberian black pig can roam around and eat the acorns, which makes their flesh, when eaten, probably one of the best of pork you can possibly get. But one of the classic inhabitants of those kind of areas, but also found in urban areas, is the Iberian magpie. It's a endemic to the peninsula, and there's no shortage of them. They are very garrulous, hang out in flocks, a little bit smaller than the common magpie, but very gorgeous looking. And in those areas at the moment, and also during the breeding season, are plenty of blackcaps. Loads of them. There's loads more now because quite a few winter in this region and they're passing through as we speak. I just want to show you a couple of some places that I really, really love being in. And this is a place that I actually went to for the first time 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago. Pino Franqueado. My Spanish is not very good, as you can tell, but it's a gorgeous spot because you can go for long walks. And that's another great thing about Extremadura. There's so many trails and bike trails you can go on. Excuse me. And in the Cáceres province, there's no shortage. And the Cáceres province, by the way, tends to be more mountainous than the Badajoz province, which is more of a lowland area, and there's lots more farming going on there. But this particular area is really lovely. You can walk for about 3 or 4, 5 kilometers alongside the river here until you get to this really lovely fountain, which, because of the lack of rain, it's a bit of a trickle, but sometimes I understand it's a massive torrent that flows here, and it's stunning to be there. Especially when you're there on your own, and that pool there, people go swimming sometimes as well, so you can actually do a lot of wild swimming. I looked on eBird, and I was only the second birder to be there this year. So it just shows you the number of places you can go to in Extremadura, and you are the only person. It's just incredible. On my short walk here, I found a few species. Robin is a bird which in Britain we're very familiar with as being a town city bird, but here in Extremadura, and in fact in most of the continental Europe, it's much more of a shy denizen of woodlands, and they breed in these areas, but for most of Extremadura they are winter visitors from the north. Searle bunting is another bird classic of this kind of area, classically found in the UK. Certainly it's only a bird you can only kind of find in the deep southwest, around the Plymouth area and Exeter and all that sort of stuff. But here in the right habitat, you will find them quite easily. And I was lucky enough to see a dipper as well. The dipper is a bird that is hard to come by, even though there are populations in the fast flowing rivers in the Monfragüe area and other areas. But to come across them, I mean, this year I've only seen two in the whole year. But if you know where to go and you stake them out, I'm sure you'll find them. But always a pleasure to see dippers. One of my favourite spots is a place called Pico Villocas, Villocas even, and it's, if you can imagine that map I showed you, and if you can remember Guadalupe, well, it's very close to Guadalupe. In fact, this picture is looking towards Guadalupe, and I think Guadalupe is probably where that blue dot of light is around that area. But it's a spectacular place. I love coming or going there because it's so quiet. During the summer, I mean, obviously it gets visitors, but in the autumn and in the spring and even in the winter maybe not, because it might be a bit icy and snowy, but certainly during the other seasons, it's just a lovely place to be and to walk along this path, and to watch for rock inhabiting species. I mean, in the bushes I've found wren. Now the wren in the UK is a bird that's found in people's gardens, but here in Extremadura it's more of a mountain bird. So wren and also dunnock is another mountain bird, and I'm sure you get alpine accenta here as well. But it's a very beautiful place just to walk around. These trees will attract crested tits and nuthatches, and both blue and great tits as well, and short-toed tree creepers. And in the skies, you know, you might be lucky enough to see Bonelli's eagle, but certainly vultures, golden eagles, a great possibility, and excuse me, and maybe birds like goshawk. Just fantastic vistas. Often there's hardly anyone. You can spend time just sitting somewhere, just contemplating life, which I do quite a lot when I'm out in these places. Often I just pick up my car key, get in the car, and drive somewhere, and then stop. Doesn't matter where you are, because you're going to find somewhere that's beautiful. And this is a view looking south into Extremadura. I always see this area as being the rooftop of the region, really, because it gets gradually flatter the more south you go towards Andalusia. And this is the pinnacle point where, if you stand around here, you may see birds like black-eared wheatear during the summer, and also blue rock thrush is a classic bird, as well as other species like the black redstart, which is found quite commonly in these mountain areas. It's another species that in the lowland areas are more likely to be seen in the winter. Egyptian vultures, again, can be seen anywhere, but I've seen them in this particular site as well. Not particularly numerous. You know, for every 100 Griffin vultures, you might luckily see one, maybe more, you know, in terms of more Griffin vultures, but there's not many of them, but they do occur. You just have to keep your eye out, looking at the flocks of soaring raptors, and you might spot a Egyptian vulture. Red-billed chuff is another species to be found in this area. They are quite local, actually, in Extremadura. I've gone years without seeing them, and then other times you go somewhere and you see a flock of 30. You know, I was lucky actually, because this particular instance I photographed a bird feeding its young, and it was ringed, as you can see, and it's turned out that this bird was actually ringed about 100 miles northwest of Madrid, and Madrid from there is about 2.5 hours away to drive, and it hadn't been seen since. It was ringed in 2016 and not seen since, until that day when I photographed it. And it was actually the first ever example of a ringed chuff in Extremadura, so I was quite chuffed with that. The classic bird that people look for here is the rufous-tailed rock thrush, very localized, mostly in the mountain areas to the north. I'm sure there's other mountain areas that have pairs of these birds, but you just have to look for them, and there's so many areas to look through. It will take a lifetime to try and map everywhere if you're doing it on your own. So anyway, I'm going to come a bit further south into lowland areas of Extremadura and into, the southern, obviously we're in the northern part of Extremadura in the Cáceres province. And this is the embalse de Al Colgerin, which is a fairly young reservoir. It's a big reservoir. I believe that it's only about 15 or 16 years old. And it's my friend Martin Kelsey's local patch. And he recalls when they first flooded the land, but it was very muddy and there was lots of waders and stuff. And now it's filled up. It's an amazing, one of the best places, I think, in the whole of Extremadura for waterfowl. I mean, you can go there even now and you're counting upwards of 500 great crested grebes. Have you ever seen 300 little grebes in one place? Well, there's a place to see them. And during the height of the winter, maybe 7 or 8, 10,000 duck, mostly shoveler and gadwall, but a mallard as well, but also pintail and teal. And there's also a few rarities found. Ring-necked duck has been found there, as well as ring-necked duck, smew, believe it or not. Extremadura's only smew was found there a few years ago. So it's a very good place for waterfowl, and you can spend the whole day there. Waders are also to be found, black-winged stilts. There's also spoonbills and, little and cattle and great egrets, and lots of the smaller waders along the edges, like the green sandpiper and common sandpiper, are to be found even in summer, but mostly during the seasons outside of summer, which kind of makes me, now I'm blending from Al Colgerin into just general wetland areas, because there's quite a few of those areas within the Cáceres province. And you will find not only marsh harriers hunting these areas, but also common buzzard. And there seems to be more during the winter, so they must be migrating in from further north. I was lucky enough the other day to turn up at Al Colgerin and discover a harrier flying through, which I took a photograph thinking it was a Montague's harrier initially. But then suddenly, when I looked at the bird itself, I realized it's a pallid harrier, an extreme rarity. And you can tell by the wedge of black in its wing. This bird is a sub-adult male, not quite an adult, because there was a bit of brown on its chest. And we have a population, and I use the word population in the very loosest sense, of around about 3 wintering birds that are not necessarily seen all the time. But this one was obviously on migration. It was the earliest record, I think, maybe ever. And it certainly had my heart racing. So it just shows you that anything can turn up anywhere at any time. And it's such a huge place that you can find anything anywhere. If you look at some of the water areas, wetland areas, you can turn up and see nothing. Another day you turn up and there's stuff there. There's a reservoir I went to in the Cáceres province, and I found 180 ruff, which is only a part of the flock, with black-tailed godwit. And it's so exciting to see these birds that are actively on migration coming through this region. And you kind of think to yourself, it's kind of far from any coastal area, yet we still get waders coming through. And the rice fields are really a place to check out. There's an area, for example, in the Cáceres province called Campo Lugar, which is very close to the Sierra areas where people look for great bustards. But there's a whole massive area of rice fields. Extremadura produces the third biggest amount of rice, the third biggest producer of rice in Spain. And you have miles upon miles of these wetlands that suddenly occur once they've actually done the harvesting, which normally happens sort of around about now until early spring. So you have this situation where you might, come across a field like this with loads of different waders, and then other fields with none. You have to really search. I remember one field I came across, and I counted 402 ruff in one field, which is probably maybe 2 acres, along with a whole assortment of other waders. So that particular field had something for them in there. So it's worth, just cruising along, checking these fields for waders and gulls. And also in these wetland areas, which are lot of the time makeshift, flooded because of production of rice. You have other species that take advantage. The blue throat often ends up in the marshy sort of margins of the fields, and they sometimes pop out and show themselves like this one has. They breed right in the very north of Extremadura. There's a range of mountains called the Grados Mountains, and they breed there. But the race that breeds there has a completely blue throat, not like this one which has a white spot, or the other ones which have red spots. This has a completely blue throat, and it may possibly be split as a separate species. I was actually out of rice field even, a few weeks ago, literally 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I was very surprised to see in this mowed field a bunch of little bustards taking a stroll. And in the end, I counted 12, which was the biggest flock I've encountered for years, and I was really happy to spend an evening watching them. There's lots of small towns dotted around and villages all around the place, and the Spanish tend to cluster together. It's not really sprawled out, it's all very clustered. But birding around these villages can be quite rewarding. There's always corn buntings to be seen. They're very common, despite the fact they have actually declined, unfortunately, but they're very common still, seen all over the place, and even in the cities during the winter, but in rough ground, not in the parks. And right now there's lots of migration happening, so there's quite a few warblers coming through. Common whitethroat, which doesn't really breed in the region apart from being the mountainous places, are now kind of found in almost any bush you come across. A couple of weeks ago I found this western Orpheon warbler. They nest in some of the wet woodlands and sort of Dehesa areas. I don't actually see them that often. I tend to see them on migration in spring and the autumn, and right behind it actually is was a spectacle warbler, but it's been completely kind of overshadowed by and hidden by the western Orpheon warbler. And pied flycatchers by the bucket load at the moment. I love this time of year when they just advance everywhere. So from the middle of the parks in urban areas all the way out to these areas near towns, and even in the middle of grassland areas, you'll find pied flycatchers, along with fewer spotted flycatchers. And this is a time of year when the sparrows start to congregate. And that's one thing that really struck me when I first came to Extremadura, particularly in the Catharus region. And that's when you walk down a road, or, not down a road, but down a country lane, and suddenly a bush would explode with hundreds of sparrows, literally hundreds. And that's exactly what happened the other day. I was in a rice field, and this was just part of the flock. Amazing. The Spanish sparrow tends to be more of a rural bird, even though they do come to some cities during the winter, again in the sort of rougher park areas, whereas the house sparrows more tied to the towns, and tree sparrows, which are much scarcer, are more tied to riverside woodlands, interestingly. This is another Thekela's lark, so you can see the eye, the way it looks like it's like a chameleon's eye, shorter crest, and if it was in profile, you'd see the shorter bill. I love looking at these birds, very fascinating. And right now, as I say, migration is in full spring, full flow even. So there's lots of wheatears around. They again nest more in the mountainous areas in the north, but they're passing through in force at the moment. And soon the cranes will be coming. I love hearing their bugling as they fly overhead. Extremadura has a very large wintering population. It's a very important population. I think it's at least 150,000 birds turn up from the north and hang out from November through to early March, and can be found in the rice fields initially during their first part of their stay, and then towards the end of the stay they then switch to hanging out in the Dehesa oak woodlands, feeding on acorns before heading off on their journey. And unlike storks, they're largely vegetarian. So I want to leave you with one of my favorite spots, and again, it's slightly north, so I've kind of gone all over the place a little bit, but I mean, I'm sure you can, if you ever come to Catharus, province, you'll be able to kind of work out a route, but it doesn't matter where you are because you're going to find stuff. But this is a village called La Garganta, and it's set in the mountains, it's in the north, very close to the border with Castilla y Leon. So it's very close to the border, and it's one of the spots where there's really lovely pine woodlands with crested tit and coal tit, this is the only one of the very few spots in Extremadura where you can find coal tit, and other woodland specialities like sparrowhawks and goshawk. And this mountain in front of you in front of us with the snow, that's Castile y Leon, so we're right close to the border with that area, and it's a good spot to find, believe it or not, carrion crow, which is a very scarce species in Extremadura. This is a hotspot for carrion crow, and interestingly, when you hear them call, they sound very different, and I reckon one day they'll make them into a different species, just like they're considering with the dunnock. Would you believe the Iberian dunnock could be a thing? It could be. But in that area, you can see a wide range of stuff. I mean, crossbill is another good species that is scarce elsewhere that could be seen there. European nightjar, one of the few areas in Extremadura where you can actually hear them singing, and you can find pied flycatchers nesting. Honey buzzard, which is another scarce bird, but mostly found in the valleys, the wooded valleys and mountainous areas. You can find one or two up there as well. And the bird that a lot of people come to see in near La Garganta is the redback shrike. It's the only, I believe it's the only spot in the whole of Extremadura where they breed. And we're talking about maybe 6 or 7 pairs, maybe a bit more, but no more than that really. Interesting bird because its migration, instead of migrating south, it heads back north over the top of northern Spain, southern France, and then back down Italy to get into Africa. So it's a very strange migrational route, and that's why there's been no reports, as far as I know, of redback shrike any further south in Extremadura. So that is a very, very quick, very, very, very rapid look at the Catharus province in Extremadura. It's an area that you will find lots of hidden gems. You'll find places like I do that you've never heard of, that no one's been to according to eBird, yet there's so much that can potentially be seen. So I recommend that if you do come, then check out the Catharus province, give us a shout if you want to know more information, or contact the tourism board. So before I go, just want to say a bit of a shameless plug in here. The Urban Birder World Membership Club, I'll keep on going on about it all the time, but you must be part of this. Please join, because it's going to be a great thing in the future. I'm hoping that we can be a force around the world for conservation of urban birds. So again, if you need to know more, please get in touch. So thank you very much, guys, for allowing me to talk to you about the Catharus province of Extremadura. It's a fantastic place in southwestern Spain, and you must come.